Everyone, welcome to the video lecture for Unit 4, Module 8.4. In this one, we're going to wrap up Module 8 by discussing the excretory system, the effects of aging on the urinary system, and urine transport, storage, and elimination. As always, here are your learning objectives. Be sure to reference these when studying for both the lecture quiz as well as the unit exam. Let's go ahead and get started. So filtrate modification and urine production end when the fluid enters the renal pelvis. The urinary tract, which are the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra, transports, stores, and eliminates urine. A pyelogram is an image of the urinary system. It's obtained by taking an X-ray of the kidneys after a radiopaque dye has been administered intravenously. Such an image provides an orientation to the relative sizes and positions of the main structures. Note that the sizes of the minor and major calyces, the renal pelvis, and the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the proximal portion of the urethra are somewhat variable. These regions are lined by a transitional epithelium that can tolerate cycles of distension and contraction without damage. The ureters are a pair of muscular tubes that extend out of the kidneys to the urinary bladder, a distance of about 30 centimeters. Each ureter begins at the funnel-shaped renal pelvis. The ureters extend inferiorly and medially, passing over the anterior surfaces of the psoas major muscles. The ureters are retroperitoneal and are firmly attached to the posterior abdominal wall. The paths taken by the ureters in men and women are different due to the variation to the nature, size, and positions of the reproductive organs. In males, the base of the urinary bladder lies between the rectum and the pubic symphysis. In females, the base of the urinary bladder sits inferior to the uterus and anterior to the vagina. The ureters penetrate the posterior wall of the urinary bladder without entering the peritoneal cavity. They pass the bladder wall at an oblique angle. The ureteral openings are slit-like rather than rounded. This shape helps prevent the black flow of urine towards the ureter and the kidneys when the urinary bladder contracts. The wall of each ureter consists of 3 layers. 1, an inner mucosa made up of transitional epithelium and the surrounding lamina propria. 2, a middle muscular layer made up of longitudinal and circular bands of smooth muscle. And 3, an outer connective tissue layer that is continuous with the fibrous capsule and the peritoneum. About every 30 seconds, a peristaltic contraction begins at the renal pelvis. As it sweeps along the ureter, it forces urine towards the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is a hollow muscular organ that serves as a temporary reservoir for urine. The dimensions of the urinary bladder vary with its state of distension. A full urinary bladder can contain as much as a liter of urine. A layer of peritoneum covers the superior surfaces of the urinary bladder. Several peritoneal folds assist in stabilizing its position. The median umbilical ligament extends from the anterior superior border of the umbilicus, or the navel. The lateral umbilical ligaments pass along the sides of the bladder to the umbilicus. These fibrous cords are the vestiges of the 2 umbilical arteries, which supplied blood to the placenta during embryonic and fetal development. The urinary bladder's posterior, inferior, and anterior surfaces lie outside the peritoneal cavity. In these areas, tough ligamentous bands anchor the urinary bladder to the pelvic and pubic bones. In sectional view, the mucosal lining the urinary bladder is usually thrown into folds, or rugae, that disappear as the bladder fills. The triangular area, bounded by the openings of the ureters and the entrance to the urethra, makes up a region called the trigon of the urinary bladder. There, the mucosa is smooth and very thick. The trigon acts as a funnel that channels urine into the urethra when the urinary bladder contracts. The urethral opening lies at the apex of the trigon at the most inferior point of the urinary bladder. The region surrounding the urethral opening is known as the neck of the urinary bladder. It contains a muscular internal urethral sphincter. The smooth muscle fibers of the sphincter provide involuntary control of the discharge of urine from the bladder. The urinary bladder is innervated by postganglionic fibers from the ganglia in the hypogastric plexus and by parasympathetic fibers from the intramural ganglia that are controlled by branches of the pelvic nerves. The wall of the urinary bladder contains mucosa, submucosa, and mucociliary layers. The mucociliary layer consists of inner and outer layers of longitudinal smooth muscle, with a circular layer between the 2. Together, these layers form the powerful detrusor muscle of the urinary bladder. When this muscle contracts, it compresses the urinary bladder and expels urine into the urethra. The urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder and transports urine to the exterior of the body. The urethra of males and females differ in length and function. In males, the urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder to the tip of the penis. The distance may be 18 to 20 centimeters. We subdivide the male urethra into 3 segments: the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and the smudgy urethra. The prostatic urethra passes through the center of the prostate gland. The membranous urethra includes the short segment that penetrates the urovaginal diaphragm. the muscular floor of the pelvic cavity. The spongiurethra, or the penile urethra, extends from the distal border of the urogenial diaphragm to the external opening, or the external urethral orifice, at the tip of the penis. In females, the urethra is very short. It extends 3 to 5 centimeters from the bladder to the vestibule. The external urethral orifice near the anterior wall of the vagina. In both sexes, where the urethra passes through the urogenial diaphragm, a circular band of skeletal muscle forms the external urethral sphincter. This muscular band acts as a valve. The external urethral sphincter is under voluntary control to the perineal branch of the pudendal nerve. This sphincter has a resting muscle tone and must be voluntarily relaxed to permit micturition. The urethral lining consists of a stratified epithelium that carries from transitional epithelium at the neck of the urinary bladder to stratified columnar epithelium at the midpoint to stratified squamous epithelium near the external urethral orifice. The lamina propria is thick and elastic. The mucosa is folded into longitudinal creases. Mucin-secreting cells are located in the epithelial pockets. In males, the epithelial mucous glands may form tubules that extend into the lamina propria. Connective tissues of the lamina propria anchor the urethra to surrounding structures. In females, the lamina propria extends an extensive network of veins. Concentric layers of smooth muscle surround the entire complex. As we've seen, urine reaches the urinary bladder by peristaltic contractions of the ureters. The micturition reflex coordinates this process of urination. As the bladder fills with urine, stretch receptors in the bladder wall are stimulated. Afferent fibers in the pelvic nerves carry impulses to the sacral spinal cord. The increased level of activity in the fibers, 1, facilitates parasympathetic motor neurons in the sacral spinal cord, and 2, stimulates interneurons that relay sensation to the thalamus and then, through projection fibers, to the cerebral cortex. As a result, you become aware of the fluid pressure in your urinary bladder. The urge to urinate generally appears when your bladder contains about 200 milliliters of urine. The micturition reflex begins when the stretch receptors provide adequate stimulation to parasympathetic preganglionic motor neurons. A further increase in bladder volume begins the cycle again, usually within an hour. Each increase in urinary volume leads to an increase in stretch receptor stimulation that makes the sensation more acute. Once the volume exceeds 500 milliliters, the bladder contractions triggered by the micturition reflex may generate enough pressure to force open the internal urethral sphincter. This opening leads to a reflexive relaxation of the external urethral sphincter. Urination takes place despite voluntary opposition or potential inconvenience. At the end of a typical micturition, less than 10 milliliters of urine remains in the bladder. Infants lack voluntary control over urination because the necessary corticospinal connections have yet to be established. Accordingly, toilet training before the age of 2 often involves training the parent to anticipate the timing of the reflex rather than training the child to exert conscious control. Incontinence is the inability to control urination voluntarily. Trauma to the internal or external urethral sphincter can contribute to incontinence in otherwise healthy adults. For example, some mothers develop stress urinary incontinence, or SUI, if childbirth overstretches and damages the sphincter muscles. In this condition, increased intra-abdominal pressures, caused, for example, by a cough or a sneeze, can overwhelm the sphincter muscles, causing urine to leak out. Incontinence can also develop in older people due to a general loss of muscle tone. Damage to the central nervous system, the spinal cord, or the nerve supplied to the urinary bladder or external urethral sphincter can also produce incontinence. For example, incontinence commonly accompanies Alzheimer's disease or spinal cord damage. In most cases, the affected individual develops an automatic bladder. The micturition reflex remains intact, but voluntary control of the external urethral sphincter is lost, so the person cannot prevent the reflexive emptying of the urinary bladder. Damage to the pelvic nerves can abolish the micturition reflex entirely because those nerves carry both afferent and efferent fibers of this reflex arc. The urinary bladder then becomes greatly distended with urine. It remains filled to capacity while the excess urine flows into the urethra in an uncontrolled stream. The insertion of a catheter is often needed to facilitate the discharge of urine. In general, aging is associated with an increased incidence of kidney problems. One example is nephrolithiasis, the formation of calculi or kidney stone. Other related changes in the urinary system include the following: a decrease in the number of functional nephrons. The total number of kidney nephrons decreases by 30 to 40% between the ages of 25 and 85. A reduction in the GFR. This reduction results from fewer glomeruli, cumulative damage to the filtration apparatus in the remaining glomeruli, and reduced renal blood flow. A reduced sensitivity to ADH. With age, the distal portions of the nephron and collecting system become less responsive to ADH. Water and sodium ions are reabsorbed at a reduced rate, and more sodium ions are lost in urine. Problems with the micturition reflex. 3 factors are involved in such problems: 1. The sphincter muscles lose muscle tone and become less effective at voluntarily retaining urine. This leads to incontinence, often involving slow leakage of urine. 2. The ability to control micturition can be lost due to stroke, Alzheimer's disease, or other CNS problems affecting the cerebral cortex or hypothalamus. 3. In males, urinary retention may develop if the prostate gland enlarges and compresses the urethra, restricting the flow of urine. The urinary system excretes waste produced by other body systems, but it's not the only organ system involved in excretion. Indeed, the urinary, integumentary, respiratory, and digestive systems are together regarded as the anatomically diverse excretory system, whose components perform all the excretory functions that affect the composition of body fluids. So in the integument system, water losses and electrolyte losses and sensible perspiration can affect the volume and composition of the plasma. The effects are most apparent when losses are extreme, such as during peak sweat production. Small amounts of metabolic waste, including urea, are also eliminated in perspiration. In the respiratory system, the lungs remove the carbon dioxide generated by cells. Small amounts of other compounds, such as acetone and water, evaporate into the alveoli and are eliminated when you exhale. In the digestive system, the liver excretes small amounts of metabolic waste produced in bile. You lose a variable amount of water in feces. These excretory activities have an impact on the composition of body fluids. The respiratory system, for example, removes carbon dioxide from the body. Note that the excretory functions of these systems are not regulated as closely as those are in the kidneys. Under normal circumstances, the effects of integumentary and digestive excretory activities are minor compared with those of the urinary system.